Hello, everyone, and welcome. So nice to see so many of you joining us live, and welcome to those of you who are watching this on your own time. Happy to have all of you here. Today's topic is usually one that generates a lot of anxiety for students and families. So I love to talk about it, hopefully to dispel some of that anxiety. My name is Stephanie Meade. My company is the Collegiate Edge, and we work one-on-one with students through the entire their high school and college preparation process. I am an independent educational consultant, which means I do that work privately, not in the confines of a school, which also means I've had the privilege of working with students from all different kinds of high schools and backgrounds, which has given me the opportunity to learn about a lot of different scenarios. And I have worked with students and families in the college going space for over 30 years. So tonight's topic is the personal statement, the college essay, the big one that, as I said, generates a lot of anxiety, doesn't necessarily have to. And I hope that by the end of our time together in this conversation, you will feel that way. So let me talk about what is going to be covered here. So first, I'm going to offer some background on what is this essay, what is it supposed to be. Then I'm going to explain its role in the process because that sort of helps inform what the students should write about, how to write it. I'm going to share some ideas about how to write it, some sort of best tips and best practices. I'm going to talk about the role of parents. And as much as I can, I'm going to sprinkle in a lot of ideas and anecdotes from students I've worked with and essays I've seen, because I find that just throwing those things out tends to get people's wheels turning because it reminds them of something they might be able to use or write about from their own life. So first of all, let's start with a little background. What is this essay? It has a lot of names. On the Common Application, and by the way, if you have questions about the Common Application, please see the video I did last, which is a detailed explanation and walkthrough of that application. But very, very briefly, it's a college application platform that is used by over 1,000 different colleges. And a big chunk of it is the same that goes to all colleges. And one of the pieces that's in that chunk that goes to all colleges is what they call on the Common App the personal essay. You may have heard it referred to as the personal statement, the college essay, but personal is an important word. So what it is a single essay that is up to 650 words, which goes to all the colleges on the Common Application. So let's think for a second about what its function is, because I think understanding what its function is and what it's supposed to do really helps you think about what to write and how to write. So it should reveal a little bit about how the student is, who the student is, excuse me, something about the student that shows a little bit of personality and something specific. It should generally offer information that is not found elsewhere in the application. So that's something to think about too. What have I not shared yet? It should demonstrate some kind of thoughtfulness, some insight, perhaps some vulnerability and a little humanity. But most importantly, it needs to be genuine and authentic, not kind of manufactured or contrived in any way, and definitely in the student's voice. And sometimes students are surprised by this concept of showing vulnerability or humanity because they think they have to appear to have it all together. But you know that when you read something where somebody is sharing something about themselves in a vulnerable way, it makes us feel connected to the person, and that will happen to the reader as well. Another thing it can do, it doesn't have to, but it can support a sort of narrative or intentional theme that is running throughout the application. So, it could be if the person's whole all of their activities and everything they do centers around service or centers around music or centers around a passion for history, for example. You could use the essay to craft a narrative around that. So an example of that, speaking of a passion for history, is a student who was just born to be a history major. And he ended up writing about the dinner table conversations that he had with his parents and his siblings, and how those kinds of conversations always sort of sparked and fed his passion for history. So it gave us context for why he was interested in what he was interested in, but it also gave us a window into this other aspect of his life, which was his family. So that's an example of how you can use it to kind of intentionally support a theme. It should show some writing proficiency. Now, let's remember they are not looking for Pulitzer Prize winning writing, and it is definitely supposed to be written by a 17-year-old kid. But it should just show that the student can string some thoughts together, communicate some clarity of thought, and knows the basic rules of writing. It doesn't have to be flawless without a single semicolon out of place, but it should show clear writing proficiency. So those are the things that it should be. Let's talk about some don'ts, some things it shouldn't be. And these are also sort of common misconceptions that I find people have about what the essay should be. So first of all, it should definitely not repeat the resume. Sometimes that is what happens, where it ends up being a laundry list of I did this, I did this, I did this. There is another place in the application to share that information. Again, details on that in the previous video I did on the Common App. So it's not for that. It also should not focus on what I call making the student look impressive. It's not all about looking good. Just as I mentioned a minute ago, we tend to connect more when people share about imperfection or a struggle or some vulnerability. But this can be hard for students to, feel like they're showing the college a flaw and that's going to give the college a reason to reject them. And that's not at all how this process works. The vast majority of colleges in this country practice some kind, well, many colleges, I should say, practice some kind of holistic admissions, meaning they really try to get a sense of the whole person, including, what they might share about themselves that isn't perfect. And also, along with the not having the goal be to look impressive, don't exaggerate, don't embellish, don't make things up that you didn't do. Along those same lines, don't sometimes students feel like they have to have a really grand, epic topic that they really have to talk about how they're going to solve world peace or world hunger or whatever it might be. And again, sort of looking impressive and looking like they have to share these really big ideas. And that is with rare instances, I can't really even think of an essay that I've seen like that has worked, but there probably are some. But again, the idea is that the essay should be about the student, not about this big topic. So that's another possible trap. Now, this may sound like a little bit of a contradiction, but also don't be too modest. If you don't tell them what you did or how you grew or what you reflected on and why and what was meaningful to you, they won't know. So, and that's a place where parents, I think, can be helpful, is because you might think students tend to brag on their essays. They're actually more likely to not share things that colleges really want to know. Another sort of thing to be careful of is don't write about something that happened too long ago. You can reference something early in life if you then reflect on how it's influenced you later, but it can't be all about this thing that you did in fifth grade because the college really wants to know who you are now. In fact, I just read a rough draft of an essay that a student wrote that was all about an event that happened in fifth grade. And it was incredibly detailed and incredibly vivid, but she did not connect the dots to how that experience influenced who she is now in any way. So we will be working on that. And mostly, and I think this may be more for parents than for students, I can pretty safely say that it's not about what you think colleges want to hear. So here's what I mean by that. Sometimes students will get hung up when they're getting started with their writing because they're like, well, I don't know what they want to hear. And that is just an absolute dead end of a starting place. Because, first of all, the colleges are not monolithic. There is no one thing they want to hear. And what they don't want to hear is something that you wrote to try to impress them because you think it's something they want to hear. Sorry, that was a little convoluted. I hope I made that point. What they want to hear is who are you? What matters to you and why? So try to just let go of that idea of writing about what it is colleges want to hear. I can tell you that those essays that start from that point are almost always super boring, super generic, and look like lots of other people's essays. So those are some things the essay should do and should not do. Now let's talk about what the role it plays in the admissions process and how important it is. First of all, just be really clear, as with so many things with admissions, it's going to vary by campus. Different campuses emphasize different things. So I'm going to be speaking in very general terms. But just keep that in mind. The most important thing, it is not the most important element of the application. It is not the be all and end all. My theory as to why it tends to have that reputation and why you see so much hand-wringing around the essay, usually in August, September, and October as the student is approaching or starting senior year. And here's my theory. My theory is that families kind of wake up to the fact that everything else that's in the application is already kind of set. Like the grades are what they are, the test scores are what they are, the extracurriculars are not going to change that much. And so they suddenly panic and go, oh my gosh, I only have one last chance to impress colleges. So they pour all of that anxiety into the essay. So that's why I think it seems to have this outsized importance in terms of like how much people talk about it and worry about it. So one thing to think about when you're trying to understand how important this is and what role it plays in admissions is to understand how admissions reads applications. Again, this varies, but there were some studies done on this not too long ago, and the average number of minutes that is spent on most college applications is probably somewhere about around 9. So that 9 minutes is looking at the entire Common App, the personal statement, additional writing that they might require for that college in particular, the transcript, the letters of recommendation, the activity list in the Common App, and all of that is taking place in a very short space of time. So if they're going to spend 9 minutes reviewing all of that, they're going to be reading that essay pretty quickly, right? It's almost more of a checkbox. So that's one thing to think about it. And it really has to be just good enough. I mean, I love to tell this story on my nephew. I helped him with his college process, and he did not show his parents any of his writing or anything. He really didn't want them to be part of it. Of course, I heard from my brother on that. But anyway, um, and he did really well and got in almost every place he applied and got nice scholarships and had great options. Well, not too long ago, my sister-in-law was cleaning out something and found a copy of his personal statement, which was just okay. It wasn't amazing. And she said, "Wow, I found Max's essay. It's like not great." And I said, "Yeah, I know. It was the best he could write at the time. And guess what? It was good enough." And that's really important to remember. It only has to be good enough. It doesn't have to be the most amazing thing ever. And that is because it is just about never a game changer. And because I have such a hard time convincing parents of this, I actually coerced an admissions official to give me something I could share with you. I was touring some colleges in spring with one of my colleagues, and a few of us we were on a college campus at a reception, and we were sitting around, and a group of us were actually commiserating about how hard it is when the parents get involved in the essays and how it really creates problems for the students in the application. And this very experienced admissions person came over and joined our conversation. And I said, "Hey, this is what we're talking about how hard it is for us when the parents get over involved in the essays. And we know they get over involved in the essays because they think they're more important than they are. Can you give us a quote that I can convey to parents about what this actually looks like?" And she said, "Okay, sure. All right. I've been in this business for about 30 years, different positions, different colleges. And when I think back on when essays made a difference, it's probably fewer than 5." And you have to remember, this is a person who probably interacted with hundreds of thousands of applications. So it is pretty much never the game changer that people think it can be. I will often get calls around this time of year from families of rising seniors who say, "Okay, we've got our list. It's a strong list, but transcript has some issues, extracurriculars have some issues. So we need this essay to be amazing. Can you help us?" And my answer to those families is always, "I'm not going to work with you because I know that the student is not going to, the student's outcome to that unrealistic college list is not going to be changed by the essay. So that's really important to remember. Now, it's not that it doesn't matter. It's just not the high stakes thing that people tend to think it is. A couple things to think about in terms of how it does matter. So one thing to consider is if you're applying test optional, and many, many, many colleges in this country are test optional, that means that every other element of the application takes on slightly more importance. So that's the transcript, that's the letters of recommendation if the college takes them, it's test scores if the college, if you're, well, yeah, if it's test, let's say test optional, say you're not using scores, but every other piece of the pie gets a little bigger. So it's not that the essay takes on outsized importance if the application is without test scores. It just means everything, including the essay, gets a little more weight. It can be a great place for students to really show how ready they are and how excited they are for college, how they are going to fit on a campus and what they might contribute and how they're going to be part of that community. It's also a chance for them to share kind of unique and backgrounds and perspectives that also might offer unique contributions to campus. And here's something that's actually pretty important is it can actually help the admissions rep advocate for the student because the way admissions works in a lot of offices is that the rep who manages that particular territory will sort of be in charge of all the applications from a given, geographical area. And when they go into committee, is what they call it, to kind of debate whether they're going to accept students or not, the rep who's in whose territory the student is kind of like that student's lawyer, and they will advocate for them. So I have a little quote from you from somebody who was a longtime dean of admissions. He says, "A well-written essay can speak worlds about your attitudes, feelings, personal qualities, imagination, and creativity. For the admissions staff, it adds another important piece to the puzzle because it distinguishes you as an individual different from any other student who is applying." So again, it gives that rep who's advocating for the student something specific to say about what that student might contribute. Now, this may sound like it's a contradiction from what this Dean Conquerite just said about unique to distinguish you from any other individual. Is that what the essay is not all about is standing out. I hear that so often. You have to help my student write an essay that's going to make them stand out. And then they proceed to go absolutely crazy trying to find some unique topic, which usually just ends up being weird. So I want to talk about that standing out concept. I have another story from an admissions rep, which was at an admissions rep at a highly competitive college. Was we were at a lunch with a bunch of colleagues, and one of my colleagues asked a question about a topic, something about an essay she was concerned about with one of her students, and the rep said, "Look, I read 6,000 applications this year. I've been at this institution for 10 years. I've read 60,000 essays. There is nothing that I have not seen." And then she said, "And I don't remember them. I don't remember the essays." And then she said, "Oh, wait a second. I remember the really bad ones." And usually the really bad ones come from somebody's trying so hard to be unique that they just write something weird. So it might be a little depressing to hear that. It's like I've read 60,000 essays and I don't remember any of them. But I would offer that it might be kind of freeing, right? 17-year-old kids have only had so many experiences. And a lot of those experiences are going to be similar to experiences that other kids have had. So they're going to write about similar things. That is absolutely okay. That same rep went on to say, "I would rather see a well-written essay on a topic I've seen a million times than somebody trying so hard to be unique that the essay is not good." But you can still stand out without trying to. And here's what I mean. And this kind of circles back to what that the quote I just read from the Dean of Admission. Your essay can still be a story that only you can tell. So even if it's a story about something a lot of other kids have done, I'll give you an example from last year. I had a student who wanted to write about how she liked movies. And her mother, who I actually have a wonderful relationship with because I worked with several people in the family, was very concerned and said, "Every kid writes about the movies. How can this possibly be a topic for her?" And I said, "First of all, you'd be surprised. I haven't seen a lot of essays about the movies. But she had a particular relationship to the experience of going to the movies and how that shaped her as a thinker and what she wants to do as a profession. So it ended up being a really personal essay that was a story only she could tell. And so you, without trying to stand out, you end up standing out if you write that story that only you can tell. But that's not necessarily because you've come up with the goofiest topic. It's because it's a story about your life. All right. So hopefully that helps give a lot of context, because now I'm going to go into like the mechanics and ideas about how to actually do it. But I think so much of that is informed by all that context. So first of all, nuts and bolts. When do students write the personal statement? My feeling is they should not do substantial work on it until the summer between junior and senior year. That is, they have plenty of time, and they will have had more experiences because they're older. So there's, and remember, it's one essay that's only 650 words. And I just told you it's not the be all and end all. So there's no need to start working on this any earlier. There are some schools that like students to get a draft in before they finish 11th grade. And of course, that's fine. But that's my recommendation, is you don't do it before summer between 11th and 12th grade. I also recommend that they don't do it until after they've worked on developing their list of activities. And for details on that, please see that Common App webinar from last time. Because once they've really thought about what they're going to report as activities on that part of the application, it helps them figure out what's missing and what they need to write about. And I would also recommend that they do it before they do any of the college specific essays. Because if they start with some of the college specific essays, they may end up telling a story that they realize would be better shared in the personal statement. So that's my recommendation. They get their activities at least roughed out, and then they can start thinking about their personal statement. I know that there are some colleagues of mine that will have students write about why they want to go to college first in preparation for those why this college essays. And I think that is fine. But you just need to be careful that you don't end up dumping into those essays things that really are better said in your personal statement that's going to go to everybody. So just basics on how to write it. It's no different really than writing anything else, but just roughly, there are sort of four phases. One is brainstorming and developing a topic. Next is sort of outlining and drafting. Number three, rewriting. And this is probably the one I'm going to spend a minute on, because I find so many students are accustomed to writing things in a single draft. They don't have a lot of time with the way they write at school. And of course, there's less and less writing that's being assigned to be done at home because of concerns about AI and so forth. So students often have not had a lot of practice with a multi-draft writing process. So that's something I always emphasize to students. I have had kids take 13 drafts to come up with a personal statement. That's an outlier. It's usually probably 4 to 8 is more typical. For example, that I gave you that example a minute ago about the kid who wrote about something that happened to her in 5th grade. That may be still the opening of her essay, but it's going to take her a few drafts to develop that into like how it has informed who she is now and why it matters. So that's why rewriting is probably the most important step. And I love to remind students that a lot of good writing starts as bad writing. So you just need to get something on the page and start with the knowledge that you're going to rewrite it. And then finally, the fourth phase is editing and polishing. So let me go into these a little bit. Let me go into each of these a little bit. So brainstorming, that is again a place where people get hung up because a lot of the anxiety comes up there about getting the perfect topic. Hopefully the things I've already spoken about will help kind of tamp that down a little bit. Um, as you might have guessed from what I've said already, the topic doesn't really matter. If you could name almost any topic, and I could show you an amazing essay on that topic and a really weak essay on that topic. It's what you do with the topic that matters. And even so-called taboo topics, like don't write about your service project or don't write about summer camp or whatever the supposed taboo topics are. I've seen amazing self-reflective, thoughtful essays in which those were used as backgrounds. So the topic doesn't really matter. It's one way to think about it is to think of a topic that might be fun and easy to write about, that tells the story, tells the reader a little bit something about you, because something that's fun to write is usually fun to read. So you can start with that concept of fun. Another thing you can think about when you're brainstorming is what is missing, considering everything that's in the application. That's why, as I just said a moment ago, I want the students to really understand what they're sharing about their activities, because that's where they might see a gap or something in their activities that they want to talk about in depth, or an experience they had through one of their activities that really shaped them, something like that. Um, and you also want to think about things that are elsewhere in the application, including possible letters of recommendation. Of course, you're not going to see them, but you may be able to guess a little bit about what's going to be in there. So that's another thing to think about. I remember I posed this to a student once. We were talking about, they had this clear academic interest. They were super involved in their school in a variety of different ways, and that was all really obvious on the application. And I asked him, do you feel like there's something missing? And he said, "Yeah, I'm a really good friend." And I loved that. And we ended up brainstorming a story where he had gone and picked up his friend at 11 o'clock at night to go get donuts because his friend was feeling down, even though he had an exam the next day. And he went from there to talk about how meaningful his friends are. And it was really cool because it showed this very personal side of him. It was obvious he was going to be competitive academically and involved on campus, but this also looked like, hey, this is supposed to be a great person to have as a roommate, you know? So something like that. Sometimes it's a particular aspect of themselves that the student wants the admissions to see. Just a word of warning on that. Please don't make it that I'm hardworking and diligent. A lot of students say that, and that's usually quite obvious from the transcript and the letters of recommendation, but there's some aspect that you feel like you really want to show. Um, Let me just say a few words about, while I'm still talking about brainstorming topics, about difficult topics. So, um, there's a lot of, I hear this a lot. There's a myth out there that you want to share something really difficult and horrible that you went through. And this myth has a lot of traction, and I can tell you that the admissions officers do not love it. They actually refer to these kinds of essays as trauma dumping, and they don't like reading that either because it's traumatizing to them. So this idea that you have to write about the worst thing you can think of, I really want you to throw that out the window. And I'm thinking of a young woman I worked with last summer, and we were brainstorming, and she came to the meeting with these ideas about, why this particular structure in her family was so difficult, why something with her grandmother made things difficult. And I was like, these kind of sound really boring for one thing, but also just kind of downers. Let's talk about what's fun, what you're good at, what you enjoy, what you contribute. And she ended up writing a really charming piece that started about with how she was like to kind of compulsively organize her sister's room, and how she used that to be effective in other ways. And somehow she got it into her extroversion, and how she loved to be around a lot of people. So anyway, don't buy into that. It has to be about something heavy. Now, that being said, sometimes students have experienced really serious things that are important to share. Um, Oh, yeah. So I'm thinking of another kid who came in the same thing with, oh, my brother has a disability, blah, blah, blah. And we were just like getting depressed even talking about these essays. And I asked her, I said, I want you to go home and just write bullets points down about the three things that you do that bring you the most joy. And she came back with these three vignettes, which we ended up using, that were all about things that were fun in her life. Um, Now, however, sometimes there's a real issue. So I'm thinking about, actually, we're working with a young woman this year who had a very tragic death in her family. And her essay isn't about it, but she tells a story about that family member who's no longer with us, and just references that the event happened and how she's worked with it. So amazingly, even though it's an incredibly sad thing that happened, the essay is not sad. It is full of hope and full of grit and all that kind of stuff. Um, And I'm thinking of another young woman who very tragically, her mother had passed when she was a small child. She had died of cancer, and she said, "I definitely do not want to write about this." In fact, I can think of two girls I worked with who both had that sad situation, who both said, "I do not want to write about this. Everybody thinks I should write about it. This is a topic that is important but does not define me, and I'm not going to write about it," which I thought was great. However, in one of those girls' cases, she was just about to submit the application, and she said, and she had been adopted by her stepmother, so her biological mother was not present anywhere in the application. She hadn't talked about losing her, and she hadn't put her name anywhere. And she said, "This application feels dishonest to me if I don't mention my mother." And I said, "Okay, how do you want to do it?" And she ended up writing a single sentence in the additional information section that simply said, "I feel my application would be incomplete if I did not share with you the fact that I lost my mother to cancer when I was 9." That was it. So difficult topics are not mandatory. And if you have a difficult topic, you don't have to write about it. If you want to write about it, it doesn't have to be heavy. Um, it of course can be, but I just want to dispel this notion that it has to be it has to be a tragedy in order to be a good essay. Um, if you do talk about difficult things, you don't have to share every detail and it doesn't have to have a happy ending, but you have to make sure that you don't leave the college feeling worried about you. A student I worked with a number of years ago had sustained a really horrific injury while she was on a summer program, and she had to have a lot of surgeries, and a lot of her energy had gone to recovering emotionally and physically from that. And she just said, "I have to write about this. This is too much about what was characterized my high school experience." And it wasn't all buttoned up with a neat bow, and we didn't pretend that it was, but she did leave the reader with the sense that she had developed the tools she needed to continue to grow. um, and along those lines, I want to just touch on revealing mental health issues. This is often a tricky topic. So, because I think it is wonderful that talking about mental health among young people has become so normalized. I'm amazed when I hang out with my niece and her friends, for example, at how comfortable they are talking about with what they're dealing with and how they're dealing with it. And that has just become more normalized. However, you need to be, again, a little mindful about whether that's something you want to talk about in your personal statement, for a couple of reasons. First of all, if you have a mental health issue or really any disability or difficulty of any kind, do you want that to define your application to the extent that you write your entire personal statement about it? Or do you have other things to share that show more of what you might contribute and what you might bring, as opposed to what your challenges have been? Um, and if you do write about mental health issues, even though, again, it's normalized and admissions officers are used to reading about it, you have to bear in mind that resources for supporting students with mental health issues are limited on campuses, and they're more strained than they used to be. So they may be, they are not allowed to discriminate on the basis of a mental health issue, but what might be running through their minds is, do we have enough resources to support all of these kids and the mental health support that they're going to need? So if you do talk about it, again, make sure you leave the reader feeling comfortable that you have the tools you need to succeed and take care of yourself, and that you are not going to be needing resources that they can't provide. I know that's not like, I wish I didn't have to say all that about dealing with mental health issues in essays, but I do think you have to be really smart about that. Okay. Oh, and one other thing is, remember, you have that additional information section, that additional 300 words besides the personal statement on the common application. And that could be a place to just share a few sentences about a difficulty, and then you leave space for your personal statement to be about something else. Okay. Other things about how to write it. A frequent objection I hear from students is, "I hate writing about myself. I hate talking about myself." And I get that. I think most of us feel self-conscious, at least, and may actually hate it. So I sort of remind students that they're not doing that. You're not talking about yourself. Another way to reframe it is simply that you're going to tell a story from your life that lets us learn a little something about you. And that, I think, takes off a lot of the weight of, "I have to write about myself." If somebody feels really stuck, an exercise you can try is just free write for 5 minutes a day for a few days in a row. Preferably by hand on paper. There are all kinds of studies that show that when we use our hand, it's just linked to our brain in a way that helps things flow more easily. Some kids are so keyboard, accustomed that might not work for them, but generally speaking, writing by hand is great, and ideas will almost certainly emerge. Um, and then another sort of tip is relating to what I said before, which is looking for a small story that is unique to you, right? Remember, you can't necessarily come up with a unique topic, but you stand out by telling a story no one else can tell. And it's the opposite of this idea of like, I have to have this epic topic. And I would encourage students to think of a discrete moment in time, because often our biggest insights come from little small moments, not from something epic that happened to us. Um, and really, all you need is just a kernel of an idea, and you can develop a story around that. So let's talk a little bit about sometimes people can use the prompts. I'm going to just pull up and share my screen here. The prompts from the Common App. There we go. I think you can see that. And they haven't changed for years. And you'll notice that number 7 is topic of your choice. The way I usually work with the prompts is I don't. I usually say to students, write the story that you want to write, tell the story that you want to tell, and then we'll find the prompt that fits it the best. And you'll see that the prompts are pretty generic, like especially, number 1, almost anything can work for that. Number 2 is, a lot of things fit into that. Um, and then, of course, you've always got number 7, which is topic of your choice. However, I do find that there's some students that find it helpful to look at the prompts if they're feeling stuck with the brainstorming. And this is I just Googled Common App essay prompts if you want to pull these up, or if you've created your own Practice Common App account, like I described in the previous video, you can look at them there. But again, I only show them to students if they're really stuck and I think it will help them brainstorm. So that's another thing you can do that can be helpful for some students. Let me get back to where I was. There we go. Okay, so that was all about brainstorming and finding the topic. So part number 2 in the writing, how to write, is outlining, drafting, and I'll lump it together with 3, which is rewriting, since I already talked about that. So just like any good writing, you want to think about sort of story structure. I think it's a really good idea to have some kind of a hook at the beginning, and avoid sort of intros, long setups, the kind of what I call throat clearing, sort of getting ready to talk about what you're going to talk about. Again, 650 words is not very long. And these poor admissions people might have been already reading essays for 8 hours by the time they get to theirs. I'm a big fan of starting kind of in the middle of the action. Right. And I encourage students to sometimes think about movies or shows that start right in the middle of the story and you don't even know what's going on. Like a car pulls up and somebody leaps out and runs into a building and the car bursts into flame. You immediately are like, okay, how did we get there? So that's obviously more dramatic than you would probably want for a college essay, but that's the idea. That kind of hook to pull you in, starting in the middle of the action, can be a great idea. And the intros, I would say 95% of the time I get a draft from a student, I just cut the first paragraph, just about always. It's almost always just set up, not needed. And you can, even if you can start in the middle and circle back, you can give a 1-sentence intro if you think it's needed, but really just try to get into it right away. Think about other aspects of any good storytelling, right? Intriguing characters, pacing, building tension, humor, although you need to be a little careful about that because sometimes it's not obvious that you're trying to be funny. So, judiciously, vivid imagery, action, plot twists, an aha moment, all those kinds of things that make for good stories can be elements, or you can just pick one of them to be an element for a personal statement. And humor can look like all kinds of things. I'm thinking of an essay, one of my favorite essays, a student well, kind of a favorite experience. The student got an internship in the summer between his 10th and 11th grade year in the field that he was sure he wanted to go into. And he got this coveted internship and was like the youngest person there and all this very exciting stuff. Well, he hated it. He hated that internship and realized that the profession was not for him. And he started his essay about this experience by just telling a funny story about like this horrible, awkward communication that happened that told him what a mismatch it was for him. And then he talked about what he learned from it and how he realized what he was interested in, did something else the next summer. So that kind of stuff can be very, very intriguing. And as I recall, he probably started in the middle of the action with something crazy going on at the office. It also doesn't have to be one story, like that story I just told you a few minutes ago about the kid who brainstormed three vignettes and we just used them all. And she actually, I think she introduced it by just saying something like, three quick stories about me. That was it. It was absolutely charming. So it can be that too. But all of these essays of any structure need to have what I call a so what, like why. And my favorite example of this is a kid who had actually had something very dramatic happen. He had had open heart surgery at the beginning of his sophomore year and miraculously was playing basketball by that January. So he was like, I'm set. I have my essay. So he wrote this story about his why he needed the surgery, going back to a congenital thing, a defect from birth, and what it was like, and then that he was playing basketball. And believe it or not, it was an incredibly boring essay because it was about a thing that happened to him and there was none of him in it. It took, I think, 11 drafts because he was so married to for years and years. He's like, I've got this idea. I've got this, I've got this heart condition. This is what I'm going to write about. And it took quite a while for him to turn it around to like why it mattered. So questions I always ask students to think about are, okay, what insight did you gain? Or who are you now as a result of it? Or is there a before and after? I went from being this to this because of this event. And it ended up being an actually really beautiful essay in which he talked about how much because of course he was terrified when he was going in for open heart surgery, as anybody would be, and what went through his mind and how he treasured his conversations with his parents. And it was super sweet. So, anyway, there has to be a so what. You can have the most dramatic story, but if you're not in it and it's not about what you learned and what was meaningful for you, then it's not gonna work. I already talked about the doing a lot of drafts, so just know that that's part of it. And then finally, polishing and editing falls into kind of three big categories. One is sort of global. It's like content and organization. Does the story make sense? Does it flow? The second is what I would call qualitative, and that's where you're looking for consistency of voice, diction, sentence structure, fluency, variation of sentence structures, that kind of thing. And then finally, mechanics, like just grammar, punctuation, basics of writing. So I think and I'll explain more when I get to the parent part about when you can do what, but really be careful with that because sometimes kids can get super hung up, like perseverating about basics of grammar when the essay is still really disorganized. So remember that as you're doing your rewrites to kind of go in that order from big picture to most granular. And you don't have to do that granular mechanic stuff until the very end. Um, Also, I recommend multiple proofreads. Proofread it, set it aside, go back to it a few days later, change formats, read it online, print it out, read it on paper. I always catch things that I've read 1,000 times online, but then I print it out and I look at it on paper. Reading it aloud, not to anyone, but you'll catch where you've made mistakes or you stumble or things don't flow. This is a little bit can be a little risky, but one thing I've sometimes had heard students do is they have one friend that they really trust just read it and simply answer the yes or no question. Does this sound like me? And if the answer is yes, you're good. If it's no, it's back to the drawing board. And then have, one qualified person, one person who really understands what college writing is supposed to look like, read that essay. It could be the counselor at school. It could be an English teacher who's trained in that. It could be somebody else, but don't get too much input from too many people. That is the fastest way to a boring essay where the student's voice gets squeezed out of it. I had a parent say recently, "Oh, we know somebody who used to work at a college and knows whatever, and should we have her read it?" And I was like, "No. I'm going to read it. The college counselor at school is going to read it. The more input we get, because it's kind of subjective, especially once the essay is pretty good, all the input is just what people like, just the style that people like. So be really careful about that. Okay, let's finish up here with some tips. So I said this before, but it's worth mentioning again. Have fun. Pick something that is fun to write. It will be fun to read. When I'm brainstorming with students, I really watch for where students light up, and they suddenly are animated. I'm like, okay, there's something there. Let's go with that. Another tip is watching what I call the setup payoff ratio. First drafts of most of the essays I see are like 90% setup and 10% payoff, or 90%, this happened, this happened, this happened, and 10% like why it matters. I'm thinking of a kid who wrote an essay about, it's actually a cool thing where he was a basketball player and he'd been shooting hoops in a park, and a mom asked him if he would coach her kid, and that ended up growing into a whole business. But it was the first draft was just the story of how that happened. And 10% like, I learned this, I learned that. That was very kind of trite. So it took a few rewrites, but it has to be, do the setup as quickly as you can so that you can get into the what's meaningful, the so what, the why it mattered. Here's why I'm telling this story. This is what it shows you about me, that kind of thing. Another tip, minimize, what this overlaps a little bit, minimize descriptions, like detailed descriptions. Sometimes kids will find essays online or read them on TikTok or whatever, where people have these really flowery descriptions of things that don't have anything to do with the kid. Watch that. Also, minimize things like quotes. Sometimes people feel like they want to put a quote at the start of the essay. I would say that is rarely effective. It might be, but if it is, keep it short. Things like song lyrics. So again, the whole idea is to summarize this necessary information as quickly as possible, because the colleges want to hear about the student, how they grew, what they learned. A tip that you hear for all writing, but is really valuable here: show, don't tell. You know, this is really meaningful to me because is boring. If I see you in action and how you're affected by what you're doing, I'm pulled in. So show, don't tell. And one of the ways to do that is to be super specific. Really detailed, vivid stories are much more engaging than generalities. Um, So I'm just thinking of trying to think of a story that I can summarize quickly. Again, the student who lost a family member wrote about how it had helped her in some of her service, and she wrote in a first draft just very generally how it had helped her in service. And we had her rewrite it to tell a specific story of a specific conversation with a person where she was able to help that person based on this experience that she had gone through. So that's kind of the idea there. If kids are feeling really stuck, it's sometimes great to just get them talking and recording, or have someone else scribe as they tell stories. I will often do that with students. I'll just get them telling a story and I'll just write as fast as I can. And it's amazing like how much gold is often in there, but they just feel stuck when they're trying to get it on the page. So, and there's so much technology now that makes it really easy to transcribe what you're saying. So that can help people get unstuck. Obviously, you have to go back and clean it up, but that can work. Another really important tip is I encourage my students to not share their ideas with other people too early in the process. Creative processes are fragile. They are delicate flowers, and we are all susceptible to perceived criticism. So if you show something, a very rough draft, to somebody and they're like, oh, is that what you're going to write about? We can feel the criticism in that. So I encourage students to wait to show their writing to people before it's maybe 80% done, and they like it and they have confidence in it and they're ready to defend it, because then they'll be in a place to be able to take in constructive criticism. But I really discourage people from showing it too early. Like, here's a really rough draft. Let's get your input. No. Um, which brings me to the role of parents in this process. And this is tricky. And again, it's going to vary greatly depending on the kid, the family, the relationship, everybody's bandwidth, all kinds of things. The general rule of thumb is that the role of parents in working on the essay should be as small as possible for all kinds of reasons. It's from just a developmental and parenting perspective. You want the students to know that you trust that they can tell a story that's going to be the right one. But also from a practical standpoint, over involvement of parents in writing can actually hurt their admissions chances for a couple of reasons. The first thing that happens when parents get over involved in the essays, and please don't take this personally, but it's just true, is the essays get boring because the parents tend to strip out kind of the interesting parts, the rough edges, the things that are unique about the student, and it can end up sounding like an interoffice email memo. So that's the first problem, is it just will make the essay lackluster and not interesting. But the more important consideration is that it's quite easy to detect the voice or ideas of an older writer, really easy. And it's usually not even the vocabulary or the turn of phrase. It's usually an idea. And I'm just like, wow, that's an idea no 17-year-old has had ever. So, and if I can tell that, and I only read a few hundred essays a year, and think about admissions people who read thousands, and what happens is that can call obviously the authorship of the essay into question, but it can even call the integrity of the rest of the application and possibly even the transcript into question, right? Who's been writing the history papers for this kid? So please be very, very careful. I would say also follow the student's lead in terms of input. This varies so much by family, although this can backfire. We had a student last year who was a strong writer, but very, very anxious. And he really kind of insisted on getting input from his dad, who kind of couldn't say no. And the essay just got a lot worse. And we had a hard time kind of pulling that situation back. So I'd say follow the student's lead, but there may be kids that need to be encouraged to be more independent. If you must work on it, I would say do it without, if you're doing it on paper, without a pen in your hand, or if you're doing it electronically, only put comments in the margins. So in other words, don't start crossing things out and rewriting and actually editing, because as a going back to the different phases of editing, your input is probably going to be the most valuable on that global phase of the edit. You want, content and organization kind of stuff. Again, try to find some non-parent trusted person, preferably someone who's qualified, like a school counselor. A lot of high schools offer all kinds of writing opportunities that may be taught by people who are professionals. I've seen schools that even bring in admissions personnel to give feedback on essays. So look for what other resources might be out there. You can even look at an older student, maybe somebody who just graduated, who's gone through the process, who might know a little bit about how to write an effective essay. There are a lot of English teachers who are very comfortable helping students with their personal statements. And then, of course, there's always professional help. There are a couple of companies, Prompt and Wow Writing Workshops, that help families with essays, and lots of other resources as well. All right, that is what I had to share with you. Let me go to your questions. Laura asks if there are any topics I advise the students to avoid. I think I touched on that some in terms of like mental health and difficult topics, but beyond that, as I mentioned, I don't think there are any taboo topics, because it is all about what the student does with the topic. And if they can tell a compelling story has any topic as its framework, I mean, assuming we're not talking about illegal and dangerous things, I guess that maybe doesn't go without saying, but where people have been engaging in some kind of questionable behavior that's going to make admissions officers a little uncomfortable. And then again, just be a little bit careful about that kind of trauma dumping thing. But I don't think there are really any truly taboo topics beyond that. Okay. Then we have a question here about additional information section. My daughter took a couple of years to really figure out how to study, lock in, manage time. but she did pretty well. Took several AP classes, got mostly A's and several B's. Good for her. So she didn't come into a 4.0 and learn to master how to take AP tests and things like that until junior year. So her transcript shows an upward trajectory. She just needed a little time to figure everything out. Would that be something to mention? Additional information, how study skills, time management, confidence, et cetera, have really grown through the years. Yeah, I think that could work. And I do often encourage students to do that if there are, in fact, I'm going to go further. I think that's actually a really good idea. I'm thinking of an experience I had last year, which I'll share in a minute. Um, because as you guys know from what I've told you and what everybody else on here has told you, the transcript is really, really, really critical. It's usually the first thing that that admissions folks are going to look at. So if there is something in the transcript that might make them go, huh, what's going on here? Yeah, I think it's a really good idea to talk about it. And again, not like apologizing or complaining, and of course not blaming. You're not suggesting that here, but sometimes people want to blame teachers or whatever. That would be something I would avoid. But really framing it in the positive, like I learned how to do this, or once I started color coding my planner, I was gold, or I learned that I could take advantage of my teacher's office hours and meet with them. And in other words, if you put it in the context of how the student has developed tools that are going to help them succeed in college, it's an absolute win. And I'll tell you why I think this is such a good idea. I had an interesting experience last year. I had a kid just like this. Ninth grade was really rough. 10th grade was better. And by 11th grade, she really hit her stride. In 11th and 12th grade, her transcript was pretty much flawless. And she applied to one school that likes to interview kids, and they would not review her app until they interviewed her. And the most important question that that interviewer, who was an admissions officer, asked her was, I'd like you to just explain your transcript to me and why it looks the way it looks. Because what he was trying to determine was who's the real student, the ninth grader or the 11th grader. And she was prepared for that question and answered it to his satisfaction and did get in. So I think I'm really glad you asked that question, actually, because I think based on that experience, that's actually kind of an important thing to do. And remember, colleges love an upward trajectory. So that is all good. Question asks, is there any role for AI in the essay process? Obviously, this is a complex and difficult topic, but all of the rules around how to use AI in writing responsibly apply. And I know that there's a lot of disagreement on that. Some people think it's good for brainstorming. Some people think it's great for final polish and grammar checking. So, I mean, I think that's a conversation with your student and how you've been talking to them and how their teachers have been talking to them about using AI responsibly. And I think you probably know this, but obviously an AI generated essay is going to be not all the things I've just been telling you for the last hour. It's not going to be specific and unique to the student. It can come off as really bland and generic. So yeah, I mean, responsible use of AI, I think is appropriate in most writing processes, but I would want to know that it was not being used to generate writing that ended up being detrimental to the student. Someone asks here, would a high school poker game be taboo? I don't think so. Um, especially if it was a school event. Um, I don't, if it's a great story that illustrates something about the student, absolutely. I'm thinking about an essay a kid wrote years ago, which was about at his high school, they had extremely strict zero tolerance policies around drinking, around alcohol. And when prom came, he went to, like, I think he and his friends had gotten together and gotten a limo, and they all sort of started to gather in the limo. And he realized that several of his friends had already had too much to drink, and that if they were to go to the prom at the school, that they would all get in extremely serious trouble. And then he wrote about how he solved that. So that's a perfect example of, like, okay, that was, underage drinking is illegal, but he still wrote about it because it was useful. It was useful to tell a story that demonstrated his problem solving skills, his character, etc. So yeah, as I said, I think there's very little that's actually taboo. Question, any tips on picking who to ask for letters of recommendation? Sure. I mean, generally speaking, so of the colleges that require them, it's rare that they will require more than two teachers. So it's usually two academic teachers from the junior year or maybe from the fall of senior year. So that's where you want to start. And some schools will, some high schools will encourage students to have one STEM teacher, one humanities teacher. I don't particularly subscribe to that. I think whoever's going to write the best letters, whoever really knows and gets the kid. So that's more important than perhaps like the status of the letter writer. It's the vice principal, but he doesn't really know my kid. That doesn't matter. Who knows your kid, and who can talk about them as kind of a citizen of the classroom. I'm assuming you're asking about letters of recommendation from teachers. But think about who gets you, who really knows you. And sometimes a teacher in a class in which you have struggled can write a really strong essay, letter, perhaps more interesting than a class in which you got an easy A, because they can talk about your character and what you overcame, that kind of thing. So those are some ideas about teacher letters of rec. All right, you guys, thank you for the great questions. Thank you for your attention. I will see you actually next week. I'm going to talk about all the other essays. So come back and join me for that. And please feel free to pose any questions in the Facebook group, and I'll see you in there as well. Take care. Bye-bye.